clearly it's not a newsflash to say this country, or at least some of it, feels more divided than ever before, at least than it has in decades. Increasingly, many Americans in the so-called flyover states feel increasingly marginalized, left behind, and condescended to. So as you know, Steve Case wants to change that, and he's been doing it by taking road trips all across America to some of these shrinking cities to give them a chance to be part of the startup revolution. And Steve, who's the co-founder of AOL, launched the initiative 4 years ago. And last year it was turbocharged with the addition of JD Vance, who of course is author of the hugely successful and very prescient book, Hillbilly Elegy. And we'll be talking about JD's involvement despite the fact that he's not here. But before we talk about Rise of the Rest, Steve, I wanted to talk a little bit about the state of American cities, especially in the middle of the country. The economy is undergoing a massive transformation in terms of globalization and automation. Young people are fleeing, old people are dying, immigrants are coming. So is there a common thread that you've been seeing in all the cities that you have visited so far? 38 in 26 states, right?
Right.
Since the initiative began.
Yeah, I think there is some threads, and I think it is worth, you earlier said that a lot of people who feel left behind. I'd argue they have been left behind. And if you just look at the data, it's pretty sobering. And I got involved in this 7 or 8 years ago, and I was asked to do some things, co-chair something called the National Advisory Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship, and then made some recommendations to then President Obama, and he created something called Startup America, which he asked me to chair, and I was on his Jobs Council. And all the data we were looking at there was, for me, a little bit of a wake-up call. That essentially, all the net job creation in the country at the time was coming from startups, not from small business, not from big business, but from these young, high-growth businesses. Yet, we were only backing entrepreneurs in a few places. And even last year, 75% of venture capital in this country went to just 3 states. California, New York, Massachusetts, 75%. California alone gets 50% of the whole country's venture capital. States like Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Virginia, each get less than 1%. So California gets every week, the entrepreneurs in California, what entrepreneurs in these big states get every year. And given the connection with job creation, it's not that surprising that you have a dynamic where some cities are shrinking. There's a brain drain of people fleeing to the coast because the perception is the opportunity is there, and the reality for the last 20 years has been that the opportunity is there. So I think we just kind of need to take a step back and understand that is the dynamic that's happening. So our whole focus with this is how do you kind of level the playing field so everybody everywhere really does feel like they have a shot at the American dream because they have access to some of the capital they need to start and scale these companies. And if we are unsuccessful in doing that, I think some of the divide we have now will increase even further. And the reality we wake up this morning in Aspen, I think probably most of us are pretty optimistic about the future. I think most people in most parts of the country wake up in the morning and are anxious about the future. It feels like the things that are happening to their communities, their families are bad, not good, and they look forward with new technologies and AI and robotics and reason to be even more anxious. So we have to, in my opinion, back more of these entrepreneurs in more of these places. They're going to create some of the breakout companies that could be the giant companies of this next wave.
And manufacturing, of course, has declined considerably in recent decades. I visited Erie, Pennsylvania, and Johnstown, and places in the Rust Belt where people who thought they'd earn a living the way their fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers did have suddenly seen their way of life completely deteriorate. And oftentimes they're in their 30s and 40s when the factory starts to shut down or move to another state or move overseas, and they feel completely lost and don't really have any place to turn.
Right. We've been through these transitions before. I think it's sort of, and it's worth remembering that 250 years ago, America itself was a startup. It was just an idea, and frankly, a pretty fragile idea. The country almost didn't make it. The reason now we're the leader of the free world is because we have the leading economy. And that didn't happen by accident. That was the work of entrepreneurs, and this country really led the way in the agricultural revolution. and then led the way in the Industrial Revolution, and more recently led the way in the technology revolution. That's why we went from this tiny thing to this big thing. Each of those kind of revolutions, if you will, those waves, those transitions, were difficult. 200 years ago, 90% of us worked on farms. Now it's less than 2%. Actually, probably now less than 1%. But 88% didn't lose jobs. We retrained them to be part of the Industrial Revolution, and they moved from farms to factories, and that technology enabled that transition. You could use technology, tractors and other things, the technology of the day, to basically farm more land, grow more food with fewer people. That was a great innovation. But it required getting people retrained for this next wave, and we did that pretty successfully. And now we saw the Industrial Revolution kind of subside, manufacturing decline, and we have not done as good a job as we need to in terms of retraining, reskilling people for this next wave. Now, I'm optimistic because as we've traveled around the country and seen these entrepreneurs doing these amazing things in some of these rise of the rest cities, it really builds on the legacy of those cities. So in Pittsburgh, for example, there's a lot of innovation now around robotics because Carnegie Mellon's there, and this was the steel capital kind of powered the whole Industrial Revolution. They're really good at making things. And in cities like St. Louis and Omaha and Louisville, they're pretty good at farming. They've been doing it for a long time. So some of the most interesting agriculture technology companies, ag tech companies, are not surprisingly kind of based there. Just last month, we did a southern swing, and we're in cities like Birmingham, Chattanooga, Memphis, Louisville. A city like Chattanooga, the winner of our pitch competition, was a company that basically has provided almost like a Bloomberg data feed for the trucking industry. I didn't know this, but apparently, like Chattanooga is the Silicon Valley of trucking. Like some of the most significant trucking companies are based in Chattanooga. So interestingly, some entrepreneurs said there's a better way to do this to serve the trucking industry. I don't think that insight would come from an entrepreneur sitting in an office in Manhattan or kind of in Palo Alto. It came because they lived in that community, saw that that firsthand. So
which is great until they're replaced by driverless trucks.
And we need to think about that transition. And so, but to me, going back to this transition from agriculture, industrial to technology, there's no question new technologies will disrupt industries and destroy jobs. Always has been the case, always will be the case. So absolutely, AI, robotics, driverless trucks, all these things will have a negative impact on jobs. That's not up for debate. What's up for debate is, are we going to figure out enough new ideas that create new companies and actually new industries to offset, at least in part, the loss that's going to happen? And are we going to be able to do that in a more inclusive way as opposed to just in a few places? That, to me, is the central question. I'm optimistic we can do that, but I recognize it might be different this time. There are some reason to be concerned about the pace of innovation, and maybe we aren't going to be able to create enough new jobs. But I'm reminded that when I started AOL, co-founded in 1985, only 3% of people were online in the country, and those 3% were online 1 hour a week. And nobody believed in the idea of the internet.
The good old days.
No, and nobody believed in the idea of email. They said, why would somebody you really think people are going to buy the computer and sit at a keyboard and type a message when they just pick up the phone and call somebody? This is stupid. It's not going to happen.
Hey, I famously had no idea what the internet was in 1994. We don't need to go
I
there.
have seen that clip. But can we play the clip? No. but the point I want to make is what seemed like a stupid idea, and our company had struggled to raise money because most venture capitalists said, I don't see what you see, ended up not just building a successful company, but helping to build a successful industry that created lots of jobs. And so what are the new internet ideas that seem crazy now? Not just a particular company, but are there new industries that we can create? My bet is if we are able to do that, and I hope we will be able to do that, it's going to be backing these entrepreneurs all across the country that bring a different perspective to bear and different insights to bear. And if we're only backing people in a few places, we're going to miss the boat. I should make one other point, which not to bum you out further, but the data around place-based venture capital, 75% going to 3 states, as I said, is troubling. The data, if you look beyond that to people, is more troubling. Last year, over 90% of venture capital in this country went to men, less than 10% to women. Last year, less than 1% went to African Americans. So we're a great entrepreneurial nation. We should be proud of that. But the reality is, if you look at the data, it does matter where you live. It does matter what you look like. It does matter who you know. Whether if you have an idea, you really have a shot at building a company and really pursuing that American dream. So we have to kind of level this in playing field. We have to be more inclusive. We have to take some of the blinders off. The venture capitalists talk about pattern recognition. They basically believe that the best way to make a new investment is to see what was successful in the last 5 or 10 years and do more of that, which actually is kind of sensible. The problem with that, if you do more of that, you only invest in companies in Silicon Valley that from people, normally white guys, who went to Stanford. That's actually what the data from the last decade shows.
Well, they talk about the meritocracy, M-I-R-R-O-R-tocracy, that people really back people who look like them and relate to them and have the same sort of network of friends. Let's go more granular, though, Steve, and talk about sort of what you all are doing with this initiative. Before we talk about sort of what a day in the life of this is like, you and JD actually connected via Twitter.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Well, the book Hillbilly Elegy, I'm sure many of you read, came out just about 2 years ago, and I read it. I was like a lot of people was moved by it, and so sent him a message via Twitter and said, next time you're in D.C., love to have a cup of coffee and chat with you. And so we met, I guess about 1.5 years ago, maybe a little more than that. And yeah, we had a nice chat. And
you had a little critique, didn't you?
Well, what I said was I really loved the book, and I really loved understanding his story and the perspective. And I thought it was helpful that it kind of was. Other people, obviously, it was a huge bestseller, sold millions of copies. Ron Howard is now making a movie. With Brian Grazer and Ron Howard are making a movie out of it. So it was a great story. But I was a little troubled when I finished it that you kind of defined the problem, but didn't really offer up any solutions. Kind of left me hanging, like, okay, so now what? And he kind of said,
he was such an outlier, right?
Yeah, his story is a unique story. And he said, well, interesting, and he was at the time a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley, working for Peter Thiel, one of the kind of best-known entrepreneurs and investors. And he said, it's sort of interesting you say that because I'm thinking of leaving Silicon Valley and moving back home to Ohio because I do want to be part of the solution. And he recognized, there's many facets that he cares about.
I thought he was going to run for office.
He might someday, but obviously not today. Maybe a few years down the road. He was encouraged to, but felt like what he's doing with Rise to Rest is a better focus, a better thing to focus on for now. So anyway, he ended up leaving Silicon Valley. Now splits his time between our offices in Washington, D.C. and Ohio, and he's a managing partner of this Rise to the Rest fund because he wanted to figure out ways to, as I said, level the playing field, want to figure out ways to educate the investors on the coast that there are great opportunities in the middle of the country. And by investing in these companies and generating great, hopefully, investment returns on that, we also believe we can help create lots of jobs in these communities and help lift up these communities. And that was something that obviously resonated with them.
So you go to 5 cities in 5 days,
yeah.
And most recently, I guess your road trip took you through to cities throughout the South.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about the latest cities you've gone to and what your agenda is. So you spend a day in each city, right, Steve?
Well, we have a great team that plans these things months in advance, and so there's a lot of legwork and advanced work to try to be as effective as we can in those cities. But it's not really about investing in a company that wins a pitch competition. It's how can we, be a little bit of a catalyst, a little bit of a convener to get the community to rally around startups, get the university president and the mayor and the CEOs of the big companies working with the startups and build more of those connections, create more of a sense of kind of momentum and possibility. So our hope is when we leave, it's the beginning of kind of an acceleration of what's happening there. So when we're there, it's a pretty busy day where we have the bus to drive around, which is a little bit of a convening platform in and of itself. It's always surprising to me in some of these cities we visited, where we're introducing people to each other that you would think already know each other, but don't. And so how do you...
You sort of gather all kind of a bunch of the leaders from the community, and anyone else who wants to participate?
Yeah, we have some things that are, for example, in this last one in Memphis, we kicked it off with a breakfast. The mayor was there. Fred Smith, who runs FedEx, is based, based there. Was part of it. And we had, I don't know, 200, kind of community leaders and talking about it. They're trying to, encourage some of the leaders in Memphis to believe in these startups, because again, looking at the data, over half of Fortune 500 companies fall off every 25 years. If you just look at the data, there's a rise and fall based on disruption. So if you're not investing in these new companies, almost like planting the seed corn, some of which might grow to the next big companies, you're going to see the number of big companies in your community decline. And many of these cities we visited have seen that. Maybe 30, 40 years ago, they had 6 or 7 Fortune 500 companies. Now it's 2 or 3, and they have not been planting those seeds in terms of the startups. So we try to kind of get people focused on that issue and get them more supportive of backing these startups. It could be as investors, could be as mentors, could be as partners, could be as customers, but just doing something. And then we visit different startups, and we always bring media along with this last one. We had 60 Minutes following us on some of the tour, because we're trying to tell the story of these entrepreneurs, trying to tell the stories of these cities. And we do have a kind of a fireside chat in the afternoon, which is open to people. Sometimes we'll get 1,000 people in some of these small cities that come out for that, and a pitch competition in each city.
Kind of like a Shark Tank situation.
Kind of like maybe a little friendlier Shark Tank. I don't know. Dolphin
Are you
tank
Barbara
or something.
Cochran or
no,
Kevin O'Leary?
We're trying to help these entrepreneurs tell their stories, and so we actually have now we have a partnership with Google, and they have a pitch coach that comes in advance, a few days in advance, and works with all the entrepreneurs on their pitches to kind of tighten it up and make sure the key messages are there. And usually in these cities, about 100 companies apply to pitch, and then we'll pick usually 8 or 9 to actually be on the stage, and then we have a local judging panel, and they pick a winner, and we invest in that company out of this a new fund. So there's a lot of things that are happening, but it's really more about kind of, as I said, when we leave, we're hopeful that we've at least had a small impact in getting people to open up their minds around the central role that startups play in terms of the community they're going to have 25 years from now, and create more of that network density or the connections, which is one of the great things about Silicon Valley. It's hyper-connected. People really kind of are super supportive of startups. When a company, an entrepreneur tries something and it doesn't work, they're not viewed as a failure. That idea failed, but they can go on. How do you create that sense of fearlessness in more of these communities? There's a bunch of things that we're trying to do, but at the core, it's really getting these venture capitalists on the coast to wake up to the reality of the opportunities in the rest of the country, and get on planes to actually visit entrepreneurs, not just get on. There's still venture capitalists in Silicon Valley say, if I can't get in the car and drive to the company, or some even say, if I can't get on my bike and bike to the company, I'm not interested in it, which seems to rather sharply narrow your opportunity set and leave a lot of entrepreneurs doing some super interesting things in healthcare and farming and financial services and all kinds of things kind of on the side.
What's the reception that you guys get when you roll into town? Is it like the Wells Fargo wagon? Are people excited to see you, or are people skeptical, or is there any kind of resentment of outsiders? I'm just curious what the vibe is when you get there.
It's changed. When we did the first one 4 years ago, the first stop was Detroit, which was deliberate, because the history of Detroit, as many of you may know, is that arguably 75 years ago, it was Silicon Valley. It was the most innovative city in the country when the car was the hot technology of the day. People were moving to Detroit, and homes were being built, and schools were being built, and it was rocking. And then in the last half century, Detroit lost 60% of its population, and then went bankrupt. And it was Silicon Valley. And there's a lot of parts to dissect, but at the core, I would argue it kind of lost its entrepreneurial mojo, was too complacent in terms of these big companies, GM and Ford and so forth, not backing new startups, not having a more diversified set of industries that really was all in on cars. But it was fighting its way back, and some of the things that were happening in the downtown area where we were hearing about. So we deliberately started there, and then we went to cities like Pittsburgh and Nashville and others. And that first time, people were like, what are they doing, and why are they doing it? And there was probably, probably was a fair degree of skepticism. Now that we've done 70 of these tours, and you mentioned, 38 cities, something like 10,000 miles by bus, people realize that we're dead serious about this initiative and doing everything we can to mobilize these startup communities and support these entrepreneurs and tell their stories and get them more venture capital to scale their companies. And so the people are much more, when we're talking about where we're going, we get a lot of mayors and CEOs and others saying you got to come here and you got to come there, and they're much more helpful now in mobilizing things in advance of our visit to make sure we can be as successful as possible. That said, as I talk about the rise of rest, talk about entrepreneurship in the rest of the country, and I suspect it's true with some of you as well, it's sort of like well, that's sort of interesting, but there's still a high degree of skepticism. Are you really going to create this breakout, like multi-billion-dollar company in like Des Moines, Iowa, or Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or Indianapolis, or what have you? And frankly, it's the same skepticism I saw, as I mentioned earlier, 35 years ago with the internet. It's like, I saw people's look in their eye. They thought I was crazy. They thought this internet thing was a fringy hobbyist idea, and they really didn't see what I saw. And I feel the same way now about the rise of rest. I'm pretty confident that we're onto something. I'm pretty confident that this next wave of companies are going to come from places that surprise a lot of people, and in the process are going to really kind of redefine entrepreneurship. I should also say that as I think about the internet, I wrote a book a couple years ago called The Third Wave to talk on this. The first wave of the internet, just building the internet, building the foundation of the internet. I see Jim Barksdale, by the way, in the front row, who ran Netscape and one of the kind of pioneering companies in that wave. It really is about standing up the internet, building the on-ramps, building the servers, and educating people why they should get online. And at the beginning of that first wave in the 80s, essentially nobody knew about the internet or cared about it. By the end of that first wave, roughly the year 2000, everybody was connected and they couldn't live without it. That then set the stage for the second wave, which was really building apps on top of the internet. You didn't have to build the infrastructure, it was there. So you were focused on whether it be Facebook or Google, basically these apps on top of the internet. And this third wave, which is just now emerging, is integrating the internet in much more seamless and pervasive and sometimes even invisible ways. And in the process, really change healthcare and food and some of these other sectors that haven't changed, frankly, all that much in the first wave or the second wave. The reason I mention that is it ties in with the rise of rest. That first wave was actually highly regionalized. AOL was based outside of Washington, D.C. in Northern Virginia. Hayes, the big modem company, was in Atlanta. Sprint was in Kansas City. PC companies like Dell were in Austin. Gateway was in North Dakota. IBM's PC operations were in Boca Raton, Florida. Microsoft actually started in Albuquerque before moving to Seattle. I can keep ticking down the list. That first wave was happening in a much more regionally distributed way. It was only the second wave, when it became about apps and about coding, that Silicon Valley rose to such dominance, and some of these other places got left behind. I'm pretty optimistic in the third wave. If you really want to change healthcare, you've got to understand the culture of healthcare. You have to have partnerships with some of the insurance companies and the hospitals, and most of the major players in healthcare are in the middle of the country. If you want to revolutionize farming, it's probably helpful to understand how farmers think, the culture of farming, and you have to be able to partner with some of the companies there as well, most of which are in the middle of the country. So I think we're set up for, as we move from this software-centric second wave to a much more integrated systems approach in the third wave, that should benefit these rise of rest cities, but only if we provide those people with the capital they need to start and scale and create enough opportunity in these places that they don't grow up and feel like they have to move away to one of the coasts, because there really is not going to be the capital and the opportunity if they stay where they are. So
you make a $100,000 investment in these potentially great companies, but you're not the lead investor. You have a regional investor that you're basically giving you're turbocharging a little bit, right?
Yeah, at Revolution we have three groups. We have a Rise the Rest seed fund that JD Vance runs. We have a group called Revolution Ventures and a group called Revolution Growth. The seed fund basically is making investments under $1 million. The venture fund typically is making investments in the $5 to $10 million zone, and the growth fund is making investments in the $25 to $50 million zone. So for example, in Detroit, we made several investments out of the seed fund, also invested in, out of our growth fund in company Shinola in Detroit. So we do different investments. We've made over $1 billion in investments in the last 5 years, 90% of it outside of Silicon Valley. So we have that, that bias. But for the seed fund, a key part of it is catalyzing more regional venture capital. So we're deliberately partnering with these regional venture capitalists, letting them lead the deals, and we're basically doing 10 or 20% of the rounds. So our typical, our average check is probably about $500,000, but we can go up to $1 million. But we want to partner with these folks. Even we're working on a strategy to create almost a federation of these regional venture firms and try to attract more institutional capital to back these firms. I think that's one of the most kind of catalytic ways to drive more growth across the country.
We have a brief video which highlights the Rise of the Rest seed fund. It was launched in December of last year, and it describes what motivates your team, what investments they're looking at, and some of the great investors and entrepreneurs who have backed the fund to publicly say, yes, great companies and founders exist outside of Silicon Valley. Let's take a look, and then we'll keep talking.
Many of the most compelling investment opportunities in the next decade will emerge from startups in cities all across America. Revolution's newest fund, the Rise of the Rest Seed Fund, brings together some of America's most iconic and successful entrepreneurs, executives, and investors to invest in startups outside of Silicon Valley and other traditional tech hubs. Rise of the Rest entrepreneurs are attacking big problems in our society: improving healthcare, reimagining education, rethinking food and agriculture, building smart cities. Today, the data is sobering. 75% of all venture capital investments go to just 3 states. Companies not on the coast are often overlooked. We know that talent is evenly distributed, but opportunity is not. We're trying to change that. We seek to level the playing field so everybody, everywhere, has a shot at the American dream.
So, I've heard of some of those people that you mentioned. How did you get them to be enthusiastic about this effort? Was it an easy sell, a tough sell? Tell me about that process.
It was a relatively easy sell. I think most of them were aware of what we were trying to do over the last years with Rise the Rest, and so when we reached out, we said we're thinking of creating a fund. So instead of just me investing, we want a group of people, including prominent, visible, credible people, to be part of this. And we raised we initially were going to have target $100 million, because when you're making $500,000 investments, $100 million is a lot of money. But there was a lot of interest and a lot of demand, so we ended up kind of raising it to $150 million. I think there was a mix, by the way. There's 50 or so people. We only have some in video, and Jim Barksdale was one of the investors as well. I'm sure there's others in the room. I don't see you all, but thank you for believing in the idea of these entrepreneurs. And that, to me, the motivations usually fell into a few buckets. One is they believed there was a great investment arbitrage. They recognize that while there are great companies in Silicon Valley, many of those companies are probably overvalued because so much of the money is chasing those opportunities, and that the same companies doing the same things in these Rise of the Rest cities, the valuations would be lower. And that arbitrage will close over time, but at least for the next few years, there's a big opportunity there, which creates the possibility of generating outsized investment returns. So that was part of it. The second part, which is probably true for about half of them, they like the idea that we would be out there building this network, out there meeting these entrepreneurs, out there investing in the seed stage of these entrepreneurs, entrepreneurs, but as they grew, and some of them broke out and needed to raise $25 million or $50 million, they might be opportunities for them to make direct investment.
Right.
So we're not just about the 150 million, it's how do we catalyze billions of dollars of follow-on investment. And there also were people that really did share our belief that while this is we think a compelling investment strategy and will lead to interesting follow-on investment opportunities, it's also a way to try to create a more inclusive economy and back more of these startups in these cities that can create more jobs in these cities and can kind of help bridge, at least in a small way, this divide that's been growing that is a great concern.
So you're hoping that you can be sort of a Match.com. So if there is a company that shows promise, then one of your investors who may have a skill set or be in that particular arena, that they can forge a relationship
Exactly.
and kind of almost mentor that company and those.
Yeah, each of the investors, yeah, they have different motivation, but some are interested in the deal flow. Some think that there could be interesting partnerships with the companies they run. You know, some, particularly as you say, in cities they care about or sectors they care about, may get more directly involved in other kinds of ways. We're just trying to, it's a first step of what we think will be a kind of multifaceted strategy to take this idea of the Rise of the Rest and build it into a broader platform, hoping to inspire lots of copycats. Nothing would make us happier than to see, hundreds of regional venture firms, get more capital to be backing more companies in their area, and to see some of that capital that is so concentrated on the coast starting to move into the middle of the country. It's starting to happen. You're starting to see some of the, the prominent venture firms kind of, opening their eyes to this. There's now 6 multi-billion-dollar software companies in Provo, Utah, for example. There's a company called ExactTarget that a couple years ago got acquired by Salesforce for $3 billion. And, now 2,000 employees in Indianapolis, so it's Salesforce's second largest office outside of San Francisco. I could go on and on in terms of what's happening in these, and people are seeing that and saying, maybe we should expand our horizons and be more open to the idea that the next great companies might be in the middle of the country, not just on the coast.
And you are quick to point out this is not a social impact fund. You really want to make that clear to people.
Well, no,
but it's mission driven.
It's mission
but
driven,
it's money
and
making.
it's really going to have impact. And there's a debate. My view of impact investing is you can generate great returns while also having great impact, and there's more and more evidence of that. But to be an impact fund, and we did some work at the Case Foundation on this because my wife Jean spent a lot of time on kind of trying to popularize impact investing. As part of that, you need to be able to measure that impact. In the case of what we're doing, measuring that impact would include things like measuring job growth. And because we're doing so many investments with so many companies, we didn't want any friction. We didn't want to have any strings attached to our investment. We wanted to be able to move quickly. So we didn't want to say, well, invest, but only if you'll do X and Y and Z. So that's why we didn't set it up and position it as impact fund. It will have impact, and in a few years I suspect we will be able to report on that impact, including job creation, but we didn't want to come out of the gates with that positioning.
And what are some of the coolest companies that you've come across in your travels?
Well, so far we've invested now in 75 companies over the past 4 years, and we're going to bring them together at a summit in a couple of months where we're going to try to figure out the different ways that we can kind of mentor them and help them learn from each other and create sort of that network effect that exists. Just going back to the recent tour, I mentioned this company, the trucking company in Chattanooga called Freight Waves. I thought that was interesting. Another city, Memphis, has a great really storied history around music. The winner there was a company called Sound Waves that was trying to figure out ways to create a broader platforms for musicians, particularly to manage artist rights and things like that. In other cities, for example, in a city like Baltimore, the winner was a healthcare company, and Baltimore has a lot of challenges, but has one of the great institutions with Johns Hopkins. Now has Under Armour headquartered there, so it's emerging as a real interesting kind of health tech kind of center of gravity. All these different cities have these different backstories in terms of the industries that turned them into great cities. Remember, if you look at this history of America, these cities, they're there for a reason. They were placed there because of sometimes transportation things, that's where rivers were, or ports or other kinds of things, and they were built they're built up and people move to them to be part of that, in particularly the Industrial Revolution. And how do you learn from those skills and build on those skills and leverage those skills for this, next wave of companies. Some of the places we've been, like Phoenix and Albuquerque and Madison and Minneapolis and Des Moines and Buffalo and Atlanta and New Orleans, we've really been, kind of all over the country, and each of these cities has their own story, not surprisingly. But if you take a step back, what's common across all of them is a growing sense of possibility around startups, a growing recognition the role startups play in terms of job creation and kind of lifting up the communities. I should say it's not just the startups themselves. The data basically says for every employee of a startup, there's usually 5 to 6 additional jobs created in the community because homes need to get built and restaurants need to feed people and so forth. So it's both a direct impact for the startups and an indirect ripple effect. And we saw that in the Washington, D.C. area when we started at AOL, as I mentioned, in the Tysons Corner area, and then we moved out near Dulles Airport. That whole area got developed where hundreds of, we had at our peak 10,000 employees, so hundreds and hundreds of homes got built and restaurants got opened and schools got started because of the success of our company and other companies in the area.
Is that how you sort of plan to make it more inclusive? Because within cities, a microcosm sort of emerges where gentrification results in kind of the marginalization or people are pushed out of neighborhoods as cities become more vibrant. And I know you all are very mindful of the diversity issue when it comes to startups, of the gender issues when it comes to startups, but also socioeconomically. How are you making sure that everyone in that community is served? Is it primarily through this ripple effect you just described?
It's a bunch of things. You're pretty deliberate in terms of making sure the pitch composition we have a broader face of entrepreneurship, and we also have been pretty successful so far in terms of investing in a more diverse mix of entrepreneurs. About 25% of our investments out of the Rise of Restaurant Fund are women or people of color, which is well above the average for venture.
Can't you get a little better than that?
What's that? We will get better than that. And you can as you travel around the country, you can help us identify some of the opportunities. But we're seeing progress, and I think it will continue. And in some of these Rise of Rest cities, they will lead the way in terms of a more kind of diverse, inclusive approach to innovation. As it relates to gentrification, we're actually talking to a lot of folks in the real estate world, because many of these communities need investment in essentially real estate infrastructure to support startups, whether it be co-working space or affordable apartments or other kinds of things. And how do we get some of the real estate investors who also tend to focus in a few gateway cities? They all want to own buildings in New York and Washington, D.C. and so forth, but there's less investment in these rise of rest cities. How do we get some of that kind of real estate kind of capital focused on these areas and help rebuild some of these neighborhoods? I remember when we were in Cincinnati, there's a neighborhood called OTR, Over the Rhine, that a decade ago was one of the 10 worst neighborhoods in the country in terms of murders, and now is the hottest neighborhood in Cincinnati. And the reason is the entrepreneurs moved in. 50 years ago, if you wanted to lift up a community, you got the artists to move in, like Soho in New York. Now the trick, the play is to get the entrepreneurs to move in. So how do you invest in these neighborhoods, create that sense of possibility, create that clustering, build that startup infrastructure, and then that will be helpful to the startups and also generate we think great returns for the real estate investors. So there's a lot of things that need to happen. We kind of like standing up the internet. This is a 10-year plus effort just to kind of put a lot of pieces of the foundation in place to drive this rising phenomenon.
I know that I want to give everyone in the audience a chance, well, not everyone, but some people in the audience a chance to, because we'd be here all day, to ask some questions. But before we do, do you make an effort to keep this non-political? And I'm curious about what you're hearing out there. Inevitably, it seems like politics seeps, as hard as we might try, into every conversation. Are you getting a sense of what really drove the election of Donald Trump and how people in some of these cities are feeling now? I don't think you can say uniformly that they went that they went red in the election, but I think you probably are sensing some of the feelings of alienation that might have driven his election.
Oh, no question. It goes back to what I said at the very beginning, that there are a lot of people who are angry and frustrated, and I'd say they have some reason to be. And so understanding that and figuring out what to do about that, so they sense that the future will be better, and as opposed to being worried that the future is going to be worse than the past, and that is the reality for a lot of people. And while I was not a supporter of President Trump, I understand why people who for several decades have felt like they haven't been listened to, and things seem to be deteriorating in their community, not just in terms of jobs, but
and Washington seems to be broken.
There's they kind of say, well, I want to shake the snow globe. There's some risk, with Donald Trump, but I think I don't like the way things are going for me and my community, and I'm going to take that risk. I was surprised that he won, but I wasn't shocked based on some of the things that we had seen traveling around. But to your, the first part of your question, no, we try to keep this kind of apolitical. We really do deliberately try to make it bipartisan. Every city we visit, we invite the mayors, the senators, the governors, irrespective of what the party is, and we're particularly pleased when we get people from obviously multiple parties. We're just trying to celebrate these entrepreneurs and help tell their stories. And I mentioned I worked with President Obama on some innovation things. Also, met with President Trump a few months ago, because one part of the tax reform that I think would be super helpful to the rise of the rest is the creation of what's called opportunity zones, where there are going to be some tax incentives to invest in these communities that need more investment. So putting the rules in place with the SEC and Treasury and so forth, I think you'll see in the next a year or two dozens and dozens of opportunity funds being created that are going to be fueled by that legislation. So we want to work with everybody to try to figure out how to kind of back more of these entrepreneurs and more of these places and bridge this divide. And obviously what we're doing with startups and jobs is only part of a broader set of issues, but we think it's important. Before we open up questions, I'd like to ask you a question, because you've also been traveling around the country.
Yeah.
And, have a documentary. So what have you learned traveling around the country that is related to this discussion?
Well, I think the most, interesting and perhaps obvious thing that I ascertained from going to places like Fremont, Nebraska, Storm Lake, Iowa, Erie, Pennsylvania, Johnstown, Pennsylvania, is this inordinate amount of change that's happening in the country: demographic change, economic change, and cultural changes that I think are coming, technological changes that are coming so fast and furious. It is really destabilizing for a lot of people. And I think it's exacerbated by the silo of media consumption that people are watching or listening to. They're looking, as a friend of mine said, affirmation instead of information. So it's only further the divide between people. But I think, I sensed a lot of hopelessness. For example, when I went to Erie, Pennsylvania, there was a young woman who's living in her father's basement. She's not that young. I think she was 40 years old and looking for jobs in the service industry. But as plants shut down, as you said, those ancillary businesses that support those major businesses, whether it's Bethlehem Steel or a GE locomotive plant, they all disappear too.
Right.
So there's a real sense of hopelessness. You add onto that the opioid epidemic, and you've got a very bleak situation for so many of these people. And I think to have sort of this economic opportunity that will build that back up is the first seed to really transforming these communities. But I think retraining is so critical, because a lot of these guys, especially the ones I talk to, have a certain skill set, and now they're going back to school. There's a government program that gives them money to go back to school and get retrained. But even those who go through that, I followed up and they said, I still can't get a job. So it's a very, very tough situation for so many of these people. And of course, what you're doing, I think, is one answer. But I think, I wish I knew other answers. I mean, what do you think is the key to bridging this divide and giving people hope who feel so left out and overlooked and ignored and condescended to?
Well, obviously, it's as you say, multifaceted. I do think at the core, having a job matters, and it's not just about
it's your identity,
income,
right?
It's your identity, and I was at a meeting a year and a half ago at the Vatican with the Pope, and he said something which I think we should all pay attention to. With it, jobs are not just about income; it's about dignity. It's about purpose. And so, if people feel like they don't have that future, they feel frustrated, they feel angry, they feel like they're letting down their family. So there's many aspects to this, but at the core, it's about jobs. And so how do you create jobs? It goes back to what I said at the beginning. Most of the job creation comes from these young companies. So how do we back more of those? And just the data on that is the small businesses like restaurants and dry cleaners and so forth account for a lot of jobs, but they don't account for a lot of net new jobs. And the reason is, if one restaurant goes out of business, somebody else will probably open up a restaurant in that place and employ about the same number of people. So as a sector, the small business community, it does not create a lot of net new jobs. And the big business community...
Or sometimes the restaurant won't replace the restaurant that went out of business because there aren't enough patrons to keep the restaurant in business.
So it could decline or it could stay even, but it usually doesn't go up. On the big business side, as I said, Fortune 500 companies, large companies kind of rise and fall. And so as a sector, there's some that are rising, but there are also some that are falling. So that sector doesn't create a lot of net new jobs, which is why this high growth kind of startup sector is so important. So backing those entrepreneurs and creating those jobs, both within those companies and more broadly, the ripple effect in those communities is obviously a core part. I should thank you for going around and telling the story. And David Brooks has announced a few days ago an initiative out of Aspen Institute that's trying to understand what's happening in these different communities. Jim and Deb Fallows wrote a book, Our Towns, and they've talked about it this week. Hopefully you've seen that. And the HBO is going to do a documentary on this. There are people that are starting to understand something's bubbling out there, starting to tell those stories, and that's critically important to get people to pay attention to what's happening here and not just view it through the context of a problem to solve, but also kind of an opportunity to seize. It is a problem. This issue of joblessness in these communities is a problem, and we need to understand that and address that. But there are also great opportunities. And so how do you figure out ways to capture these opportunities and not be getting people to do it, including some of the folks, going back to your question, who invest in our fund, not just doing it because they think it's a way to create jobs in these communities, but it's also a way to generate great investment returns by backing the next great entrepreneurs that just won't happen to be in Silicon Valley or New York City.
And I think a lot of these people want to be respected. They feel disrespected and underappreciated and mocked, I think, by quote unquote coastal elites. Right. And a lot of their values are actually very laudable, commitment to family, a feeling that they have roots in a community and a responsibility to their aging parents and things like that. So, I think that sometimes we see them through a very specific lens, which makes it very challenging for them and creates a lot of resentment from them. So I think we have time for a couple questions for Steve. We have there, go ahead. Here we got the mic.
Thanks, Katie and Steve. I'm Laura Lauder from Silicon Valley, and my question is about community colleges. So Gina Raimundo in Rhode Island has made community college free. And with that connection, then local businesses are working with the community colleges to do training for specific jobs with a guaranteed job at the end of graduation from the two-year community college. And I'm wondering, Steve, if you thought about incorporating community colleges for training into some of the companies, particularly for coding.
We have, and in different cities, when we try to kind of mobilize the whole community, we get folks, including that are leading community college. And you're exactly right. The innovation that's happening in a lot of these cities around kind of education, reskilling is phenomenal. And a lot of the leadership from mayors around the country. I spoke at the council of the mayors. I think it's 500 mayors came together a couple of months ago. They too understand that the future of their community is going to be tied to making sure they create the jobs of the future and people in their community have the skills necessary to fill those jobs. So very excited by all the innovation that's happening kind of all across the country. It's kind of an interesting laboratory of a lot of different experiments that I think we'll learn a lot from.
We have a question in the front.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm Natalia from Pipeline Angels, and I'm also very passionate about activating local capital for local entrepreneurs, so thank you for that. And Katie, thank you for also pushing and challenging about how can we make this really inclusive, because the answer isn't let's get more white guys funded who live outside of California. Massachusetts, and New York. I happen to be a cis queer Latina. My gender pronouns are she, her. I'm probably just, in general, one of the few people of color right now in this tent, in this room, and at this event. And I have to name something, a knot that came here, because when we're talking about these people, what is being left out of those comments is these white people. Because there are a ton of people of color living outside of Massachusetts, New York, and California. And I'm troubled by how we're talking about humanizing people that you mentioned have a commitment to family values, and yet they're still supporting the separation that is happening between these Latinx families in Mexico. And you're hearing me get emotional, because it's here that we have to have these conversations, because if we're humanizing white supremacy and white privilege, then where is the hope? Where you've met a lot of communities of color, I'm sure, throughout this space, and I want to make sure that we also give, that they're here and that we represent them. And I'm wearing a shirt that says resist in sign language, because we need to talk about solutions and humanizing those who are dehumanizing so many of us. I think we need a different way, and I would love to hear from both of you, what can we do so that we can remember the humanity of those of us that have not gotten the space?
Well, I think, obviously it's it's interesting, as I listened to you, I thought about the pipeline issue. So how do you kind of help people who are disadvantaged to have the educational opportunities that would even put them in a position of being able to pitch a business and to be able to rise up with other people? And I'm curious if the kind of complement of folks that you're seeing when you go to these towns, and if, in fact, while you're encouraging diversity, if you're seeing enough of a pool from the get-go when you arrive.
Yeah, we have to deliberately kind of reach out and build a broad network before we go to make sure people from all across the community understand what we're doing, and we try to include as many people as possible. And every city we visit, we do go to an impact hub. I remember one accelerator for food startups in Salt Lake City. One of the great phenomena in terms of entrepreneurship is the food truck phenomenon, which really lowers the barrier to entry dramatically. So if somebody has an idea, they can start out really inexpensively, and if that works, they usually are able to raise some capital, open a restaurant. And some of those things could be the Chipotle of tomorrow. When Chipotle started like as a burrito shop in Denver, nobody thought it was going to have I don't know what the current number is, several thousand kind of outlets. So how do you create those pathways and deliberately and explicitly try to have a more inclusive approach to entrepreneurship? And this is, I should say, it's not just about tech entrepreneurship. This is about entrepreneurship. So every sector of the economy, including the food sector and other things, are things that we're trying to encourage and invest in.
I think we have time for one more quick question. You want to do this gentleman here?
I'm from Birmingham, Alabama, and I attended a few of your sessions, and I can testify of the impact that you had. For all the reasons you've given, time is of the essence. We do not have 10, 15, 20 years to do this. So with all the efforts that we're hearing about, can you imagine a modern-day Marshall Plan for the U.S. where we bring human resources, financial resources together and move this quickly, because we do not have a lot of time?
I agree with that. I think I would love to see a more ambitious and integrated kind of national Marshall Plan-like effort, and pushed on some legislation, including the Jobs Act about 5 years ago, that did a lot of things around access to capital, and testified around immigration reform, and pushed for this recent Investing in Opportunity Act, creating opportunity zones. But I think that is just scratching the surface in terms of what's possible. At the same time, rather than wait for Washington to come together and make that happen, which I'd like to see, but I don't expect to see anytime soon, we really believe the action is at the local level. So how do we mobilize at the local level, get people like you and others in Birmingham and other cities all across the country kind of focused on that. And the key thing to watch is not just what happens with venture capital flowing, but what happens with talent. Because in all the cities we visited, including Birmingham, you constantly hear the story of people growing up there and leaving because there was an opportunity there. How do you slow that brain drain? How do you create enough opportunity in these rise-to-risk cities that there's a reason to stay and indeed a reason to come back? This phenomenon we call the boomerang of talent. As you get more capital and you have more successes, it will get more people to stay and more people to come back. Pittsburgh, for example, is now seeing that. When Carnegie Mellon graduates, more are now staying in Pittsburgh than leaving.
Buffalo's seeing that. I mean, a lot of cities, but I think you have to develop sort of the cultural outlets and make these cities fun for young people, because just having a company there is not going to keep them around, right?
But these are fun cities. I mean, they're vibrant, creative cities, and really almost all the cities we visited. And there are people that would like to move there or like to go home, but they still, as we sit here, don't feel the opportunity there is such that they're willing to sacrifice, their career opportunity to kind of, head back home.
Although the cost of living is a lot lower in a lot of these cities.
And it is changing, and I think over the next decade it will accelerate. And that we have this battle for ideas, we have this battle for capital, and we have this battle for talent. The ideas are all across the country. How do we get capital all across the country, and how do we get everybody the opportunity to live wherever they want to be and have a great opportunity for their families?
Well, Steve Case, thank you very much,
Steve,
for everything
thank you all.
that you're doing.